Have you ever found yourself pausing, maybe while scrolling through a news article or something online, and just wondering how researchers actually put a number on something as, well, as vast and personal as happiness or maybe motivation or even empowerment? It feels almost impossible, right? Like trying to bottle smoke or, I don't know, measure the wind.
It really does, yeah.
But the truth is, it's far from simple. It's actually a rigorous, often incredibly complex process that can genuinely make or break an entire study. It shapes what we believe we know about ourselves and the world around us.
It absolutely does feel like that sometimes, trying to grasp these abstract things. But when we're trying to understand human experiences and behaviors in a systematic, reliable way, we really need tools. We need these instruments that can capture those nuances accurately and consistently.
Right?
Without them, any conclusions we draw, any policies we might recommend, or even interventions we design, they're really built on shaky ground. It's all about creating a reliable lens, through which to view these abstract concepts.
And that's exactly our mission today. We're taking a deep dive into this fascinating but maybe often overlooked world of scale development and questionnaire design. We're going to explore precisely how researchers construct these crucial instruments to get at those abstract human experiences and behaviors, and critically, how they make sure the measurements they get are as robust and trustworthy as possible.
Exactly. And our goal here is really to unpack the systematic procedures involved, shine a light on some of the common pitfalls, 'cause there are definitely pitfalls that researchers face.
I bet.
And share the best practices that have emerged from, well, decades of meticulous study. This deep dive is designed to offer you, our listener, a kind of shortcut to being genuinely well-informed on this absolutely vital topic.
Yeah, so you'll not only learn how to critically evaluate existing measures you come across, maybe in reports or studies, but you'll also understand the foundational principles if you ever wanted to build your own, ensuring the data we all rely on is truly solid.
And to guide us through this intricate landscape, we're drawing on some really insightful sources today. We've got a systematic review looking at the limitations in scale development, which really pulls back the curtain on common challenges.
Right.
We'll also be exploring the essential elements of good questionnaire design, and maybe most compellingly, we'll ground our discussion with the real-world example, the meticulous validation of a reproductive empowerment scale. It really brings these concepts to life.
Fantastic. So let's get started. Okay, so we've talked about this challenge, bottling smoke, trying to grasp these invisible concepts, but let's actually roll up our sleeves here. When we set out to measure something as abstract as, let's say, motivation, what's the very first concrete step a researcher takes? Where does this whole scientific journey truly begin?
That's a great way to frame it, because it really does feel like grasping at something invisible sometimes. The starting point, the absolute bedrock, is precisely defining what you want to measure. In the human and social sciences, we're constantly grappling with these abstract ideas, things like personal motivation, as you said, or specific attitudes towards an issue, or complex social behaviors. Now, to study them empirically, to actually gather data and draw meaningful conclusions, we have to find a way to associate these, well, nebulous ideas with observable, measurable data.
Right.
It's about moving from the abstract thought to something tangible, something you can actually measure.
So it's about making the invisible visible, or at least quantifiable somehow. But how do you even begin to nail down something like happiness in a way that's precise enough for science? That seems like the first hurdle.
Precisely. And the very first critical step in that process is to have a crystal clear idea of what we call the construct, or the domain you intend to measure.
The construct.
Yeah. This involves not just broadly naming the concept like happiness, but rigorously defining it.
Right.
And if it applies, you also need to break it down into its subcomponents or dimensions. For example, happiness isn't just one thing, right? It might involve life satisfaction, positive affect, the absence of negative affect, and so on. And sometimes these dimensions are determined a priori, meaning they're based on established theory or a conceptual framework that already exists in the literature.
So building on what we know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And other times, they might actually emerge through statistical computation as the data itself reveals natural groupings among the items you're testing.
So it's not enough to just say, I want to measure leadership. You need to be much more specific, like, I want to measure transformational leadership, which I define as having these specific behaviors, X, Y, and Z.
Right.
Is that the idea?
That's exactly the idea. And speaking of established ideas, A good scale isn't built in a vacuum, completely disconnected from existing knowledge. It absolutely must have a strong theoretical underpinning.
Right.
If, for instance, you're developing a scale to measure something like brand personality, the survey items, the actual questions you ask, must directly align with a clear established theory of brand personality. This theoretical foundation is what ensures your items are genuinely reflecting the desired construct, rather than just, random thoughts someone might have about a brand. Without it, you're just throwing darts in the dark and hoping to hit something meaningful.
That makes perfect sense on paper. You're building on a body of knowledge, not reinventing the wheel every single time. But practically speaking, how often do researchers actually do this really thorough homework? Is there maybe a subtle pressure, perhaps, for academic novelty to just create something new, even if a perfectly good scale already exists?
That's a crucial and really insightful question, because this initial homework is absolutely non-negotiable. But yes, sometimes it might get overlooked or rushed. Before anyone embarks on the considerable effort, and it is considerable effort, of developing a new scale, they must ask themselves, is there any existing scale out there that already measures this concept, or something very, very similar? If a comparable instrument already exists, then the researcher has a responsibility to rigorously justify why a new one is appropriate. How will their new scale be different? Critically, how will it improve upon or extend what's already available?
Okay.
This foundational work is essential. It prevents redundant efforts. It ensures that the new scale genuinely contributes something valuable to the field, and ultimately, it builds confidence in the knowledge we're creating together. It's like, you wouldn't build a new bridge if a perfectly good one already spanned the river, right? Unless you had a really compelling reason.
Like it's falling down or something.
Exactly. Or you need a much better, stronger, or more efficient one right next to it. Unfortunately, sometimes researchers get so excited about their specific angle or idea that they might, rush this critical first step.
Okay, so let's assume we've nailed down what we want to measure, we've done that homework, and we're confident a new scale is actually needed. The next big challenge, and arguably the most visible part, is actually writing the questions themselves. How do researchers go about generating these items, and what really separates a good question from one that might just muddy the waters and give you unreliable data?
Right. This is where that abstract concept truly begins to take concrete form. And it's a phase that requires considerable pilot work, a lot of testing and refining, both the wording and the content of the questions. It's definitely an iterative process, not a one-and-done thing. You go back and forth, you tweak, you test again.
So what are the main ways people come up with these initial questions? Is it just sitting around brainstorming, or is it more systematic than that?
Oh, it's definitely systematic. Researchers typically use a combination of methods, really. The first category we can talk about is deductive methods. You can think of this as kind of classification from above.
Okay, top down.
Exactly, top down. This is where researchers heavily rely on existing literature reviews, established theories, and even detailed assessments of existing scales to identify potential items. So, for example, one systematic review found that a significant majority of studies, something like 84.7%, use literature reviews as a primary deductive method. They're essentially looking at what others have already said or found, pulling from that established academic knowledge base. Then, on the other hand, you have inductive methods. This is more classification from below.
Bottom up.
Right. Here, items are generated directly from the experiences and the actual responses of individuals, often through qualitative methods. This includes techniques like doing in-depth interviews. About 26.6% of studies use these, or running focus groups.
Talking to people directly.
Exactly. For instance, in something like a grounded theory approach, where you're really building theory from the ground up based on observations, you might need around, say, 30 interviews to reach what we call saturation. Yeah, saturation is that point where conducting new interviews isn't really generating any new information or new themes for your items. Yeah, it means you've likely captured the breadth of people's experiences related to your construct.
So deductive is top down, using existing knowledge, and inductive is bottom up, generating from lived experience. Is one better than the other? It sounds like maybe you need both.
You've absolutely hit on a key point there. And interestingly, most studies, around 56.2% in that review, actually combine both deductive and inductive strategies.
Oh, okay.
This blended approach tends to provide a much more comprehensive and robust initial pool of items. It helps ensure that the scale is both theoretically grounded, based on what we know, and practically relevant to the people it actually aims to measure. It really is the best of both worlds.
That makes total sense. You want it to be scientifically sound, but it also has to resonate with real people. So once you have this big pool of potential items, maybe hundreds even, what are the best practices for actually writing them? I imagine there are just so many ways a question can go wrong and make it hard to get accurate data.
Oh, absolutely. And there are several key principles here to try and avoid those pitfalls. First, and maybe foremost, items should always prioritize clarity and simplicity.
Keep it simple.
Keep it simple. They need to be short, straightforward, and just easy to understand. You really want to avoid packing too much information or jargon into a single question. Why? Because people are unlikely to pay close attention to lengthy descriptions, and their answers might end up being unduly influenced by those extraneous details rather than their actual true opinion or feeling.
Right. They might just react to part of the question.
Exactly. If the question is too wordy or complex, their response might be more about just trying to decipher the question itself than genuinely reflecting their experience. Second, and this is crucial, each item should focus on a single issue. We often talk about avoiding double-barreled questions.
Double-barrel.
Yeah, that's when you combine two different ideas or opinions into one phrase. For example, asking someone, I drink coffee to have fun and to socialize. Well, someone might drink coffee for fun, but not necessarily to socialize, or the other way around. They wouldn't know how to accurately answer that single question. You absolutely need to separate those ideas into two distinct questions, one about fun, one about socializing.
Got it. One concept, one question. Crystal clear. What else?
Third, ensure a consistent perspective. The question should clearly reflect the intended viewpoint. For instance, if you're asking about your experience as the respondent, phrase it as, I have fun when I drink coffee with my friends, rather than something like, my friends have fun when we drink coffee together.
Ah, whose perspective are we getting?
Exactly. This keeps the focus squarely on the respondent's own experience, which is typically what you're trying to measure. It avoids mixing up whose perspective is actually being captured in the data. Fourth, and this might seem obvious, but it's a surprisingly common mistake, avoid negatives, and especially avoid double negatives.
Yeah, those are confusing.
Incredibly confusing. Questions like, I usually don't drink and I'm not upset, just force people to mentally untangle this convoluted statement. It inevitably leads to misinterpretation and ultimately inaccurate data. It's just an unnecessary cognitive burden that prevents a clear, straightforward response.
I can totally see how that would lead to a lot of head scratching and maybe just guessing. Now, what about those questions that are phrased in the opposite way? Like, if a scale is mostly positive statements about, say, job satisfaction, and then you throw in a negative one like, I often dread going to work just to make sure people are paying attention, are those reverse-scored items always a good idea?
That's a really great question. And honestly, it's a point of considerable debate among methodologists. There's no single easy answer.
Okay.
Some argue quite strongly that reverse-scored items are necessary to prevent something called acquiescence bias.
Acquiescence bias.
Yeah, that's the tendency for some respondents to simply agree with statements regardless of the actual content. Maybe they're just trying to be agreeable or move quickly. So the reverse item theoretically catches that.
Right, keeps them on their toes.
Supposedly. However, there are significant downsides. They can be genuinely confusing for participants, especially in long or complex scales, or maybe for respondents with lower literacy levels. Also, a reverse-scored item might not truly represent the exact semantic opposite of a construct. And statistically, these items often perform poorly in analyses like factor analysis. Sometimes they end up being the worst-fitting items in the model. So researchers really need to be aware of these potential issues and weigh the pros and cons carefully when choosing whether or not to include them. The supposed benefit of catching acquiescence can sometimes introduce more measurement error and confusion than it solves. Fifth, and this is particularly important if your scale is intended for broader use, maybe across different countries or cultures, items must make cultural and linguistic sense.
Translation isn't just about words.
Exactly. You need to think about how the questions might be interpreted in other languages or cultural contexts right from the initial development stage. A phrase that means one thing perfectly clearly in English might have a completely different connotation, or maybe no meaning at all somewhere else. Failing to consider this can severely limit your scale's generalizability and potentially render your data meaningless in those other contexts.
That's a powerful reminder that words aren't universal and context is absolutely king. What about the answer choices themselves, the response formats? Are there specific types that are generally better than others?
Yes, there's a range of response formats commonly used, like Likert-type scales, for instance, are very popular. That's where respondents indicate their level of agreement, typically in a 5 or 7-point scale, from something like strongly disagree to strongly agree.
We've all seen those.
Well, yeah. There are also frequency scales to capture how often a behavior occurs. Never, rarely, sometimes, often, always, that kind of thing. A key point of ongoing controversy, believe it or not, is whether to offer a neutral midpoint option on scales like the Likert scale.
Really? Why is that controversial?
Well, removing it forces respondents to make a choice, either lean towards agreement or disagreement. Some argue this is good for getting clearer data, preventing people from just sitting on the fence. But it can also really irritate respondents who genuinely feel neutral, and it could potentially increase non-response bias if they feel coerced into a binary choice they don't agree with. So the choice really depends on the specific construct you're measuring, the researcher's theoretical stance, and, critically, on knowing your target audience and how they might react. And finally, a crucial best practice. It is generally undesirable and frankly quite rare in well-developed scales to rely on a single item response to measure a complex construct.
Just one question for something like self-esteem.
Exactly. Multi-item scales are overwhelmingly preferred. Why? Because single items are just highly susceptible to bias, to misinterpretation, and to significant measurement error. Think about it. A single question can only distinguish between a small number of levels of whatever attribute you're measuring. And individual items tend to produce unreliable responses, meaning if you ask the same person the same single question repeatedly over a short time, they might not give the exact same answer every time due to random factors or slight shifts in interpretation. Okay? Multi-item scales provide a much more robust and accurate measure of an underlying construct by essentially averaging out these individual item errors and capturing the construct's various facets more comprehensively. It's like taking multiple readings with a thermometer to get a more accurate temperature reading.
That's a really powerful argument for having multiple questions tap into one core concept. But it sounds like a tremendous amount of upfront work to generate so many potential questions, knowing you're probably going to throw most of them away. Is there a point where too many becomes inefficient, or are we truly saying more is always better initially, even if it feels a bit daunting?
You've definitely hit on a common concern. It can feel wasteful. But the research literature actually strongly suggests that the initial number of items in your pool should be significantly larger than your target final scale length, typically 2 to 4 times more numerous.
Wow, 2 to 4 times.
Yes. So you should absolutely anticipate and even plan for a significant loss of items during the development and validation process. This generous initial pool ensures that you have enough high-quality items to select from later on. It helps you achieve good internal consistency, and it allows for the exclusion of inadequate or problematic items without compromising the final scale. For a stark example of just how rigorous this process can be, one study famously started with 391 initial items, and after rigorous development and refinement, they finished with a final scale of only 18 items.
Good grief. That's a huge reduction.
It is. But it really highlights that it's about quality over quantity in the final product. You have to accept that many initial ideas, even ones you thought were great, just won't make the cut under scrutiny. It's really an investment in the long-term robustness and credibility of your measure.
Okay, so this is where it gets, for me anyway, really interesting. We have this initial, quite large pool of questions, maybe hundreds, knowing that most won't make the final cut. How do we actually start making sure they're hitting the mark? How do we ensure they truly reflect the nature of what we're trying to measure before we roll them out broadly to a large sample for statistical testing? It sounds incredibly theoretical still. How do we bridge that gap from expert opinions and abstract definitions to actually seeing if our questions work with real people? What's the very next step in practice?
That's a crucial transition point, you're right, because this brings us squarely into the phase of theoretical analysis, which primarily focuses on establishing content validity.
Content validity.
Content validity essentially assesses whether that initial large item pool adequately and comprehensively reflects the desired construct you're trying to measure. This step is absolutely vital because all the subsequent inferences, all the conclusions you draw from your data later on, are ultimately based on these very items. If your items don't properly represent your construct right from the start, everything that follows is built on a shaky foundation. Your whole house of cards might collapse later under statistical scrutiny.
So how do researchers actually go about assessing this content validity? Is it just the researchers themselves sitting in a room deciding if their own questions are good enough? Because that doesn't sound very objective.
No, not at all. That would be problematic. It fundamentally involves seeking opinions from others who can provide an external, objective evaluation of the operationalized items. And there are typically two main types of judges involved in this process, and ideally, you want input from both.
Okay, who are these judges?
First, you have expert judges. These are individuals who are highly knowledgeable in either scale development methodologies themselves, or they're experts in the specific target construct you're measuring, like experts on burnout if you're measuring burnout.
Makes sense.
They meticulously evaluate the items for things like their content relevance. Does this item actually relate to burnout? Their representativeness. Does the set of items cover all aspects of burnout? And their technical quality, things like clarity, conciseness, and lack of bias. They are the most widely utilized tool for this. That review found they are used in about 74.2% of studies. Sometimes researchers use systematic approaches, like the Delphi method, to reach a consensus among multiple experts, iteratively refining the items based on rounds of feedback. It's almost like a jury deliberation to arrive at the best set of items. Second, and equally important, you involve target population judges.
So the actual people who will eventually take the survey.
Exactly. These are the potential end users of the scale, the very people whose experiences or behaviors you aim to measure. They are essential for evaluating what's called face validity.
Face validity.
Face validity is simply the degree to which these end users perceive the items as appropriate and relevant for the targeted construct. Does the questionnaire look like it's measuring what it claims to measure? Does it make sense to them? About 43.8% of studies involve opinions from the target population in this way.
Yeah.
While expert judgment focuses more on the scientific rigor and theoretical alignment, target population judgment ensures the scale looks right and makes practical sense to those who will actually be completing it.
It's like the difference between a car mechanic saying your car works perfectly based on the specs and you, the driver, actually feeling comfortable and confident behind the wheel. You probably need both.
That's a perfect analogy, precisely. Ideally, researchers combine both expert and target population judgments to ensure comprehensive feedback. This balances the scientific precision needed with the practical relevance and understandability required for the end user. You get a much stronger instrument that way.
So we've carefully gathered these expert opinions. We've even heard from the target audience about whether the questions seem right. But that still feels a bit like a read and react approach, doesn't it? Is there a more active, maybe more hands-on way to really stress test these questions with real people before we commit to a full-scale survey administration?
Absolutely there is. And this is where pre-testing with cognitive interviews comes into play. This is a really powerful qualitative technique specifically designed for refining items, and it's done before you administer the survey widely.
Cognitive interviews, how do those work?
It typically involves administering your draft questions to a small sample, usually around 5 to 15 interviewees, often conducted in 2 or 3 rounds, until you reach that saturation point again where you're not hearing new issues. But the key here is how you do it. You ask the respondents to verbalize their mental process as they answer each question. You ask them to think aloud.
They actually talk through their thoughts as they answer. What does that reveal? That sounds incredibly insightful.
It's incredibly revealing. It helps researchers determine if the questions are being understood exactly as intended. Are they interpreting the words the same way you meant them? It helps see if the questions are generating the right kind of information you need. And are the response options provided, like agree, disagree, appropriate and sufficient?
Ah, so you might hear someone say.
Exactly. You might hear someone say, well, I'm not quite sure what you mean by ambivalent here. Or, this question seems to be asking 2 different things at once, and I don't know how to choose just one answer. That's immediate, actionable feedback. Cognitive interviewing also helps identify potentially problematic question order. Does asking question A first influence how they answer question B? And critically, it helps reduce the overall cognitive burden on participants by highlighting questions that are confusing or too complex, making the final survey easier and more intuitive to complete. And importantly, the outcomes of these interviews and any changes made as a result should always be meticulously reported in the research write-up. It shows the rigor of your development process.
After all this qualitative feedback and expert review, what's the next step? Do you then immediately jump to running the full survey on hundreds of people? Or is there maybe an initial item analysis where you start looking at some preliminary numbers from a smaller pilot test?
There's definitely an initial item analysis phase, yes. It's a first quantitative check, usually done after some initial pilot work based on the feedback from experts and cognitive interviews. This involves several specific checks.
Okay, what are you looking for?
First, researchers examine the spread of responses across the different options for each item. If a single answer option receives very high endorsement from almost everyone, like 95% pick, strongly agree, it might suggest that the item has poor discriminatory power.
Meaning doesn't differentiate people?
Exactly. It's not differentiating well between respondents, or maybe it's redundant with another item. Such items often become candidates for deletion because they just aren't providing much useful variation or information. Second, they look very closely at item total correlation. This examines the statistical relationship, the correlation between each individual item and the total score of the entire scale, or sometimes a specific subscale if you have dimensions. An adjusted item total correlation is generally preferred.
Adjusted?
Yeah, that's where the item itself is excluded from the total score calculation when correlating it with the total. It gives a cleaner measure of how well that item relates to all the other items measuring the construct. Items with very low adjusted item total correlations, for instance, maybe below a threshold like 0.30, are generally considered less desirable.
Why is that?
Because it means they aren't strongly aligned statistically with the overall construct the scale is trying to capture. They become prime candidates for deletion. They're just not pulling their weight, so to speak, in measuring what you intend to measure. And third, researchers conduct an initial check for internal consistency, often using that statistic we mentioned earlier, Cronbach's alpha, but maybe on a smaller pilot sample first.
Right, the hanging together measure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If a subscale, for example, shows a very low alpha, say, below a common threshold like 0.70 at this early stage, it might suggest that the items within that subscale are poorly grouped or aren't coherently measuring the same underlying concept. This helps pinpoint specific items that aren't contributing effectively to the explanatory power of that part of the questionnaire, allowing researchers to refine or remove them early on before the major investment of the full survey. This methodical approach ensures that by the time you administer the full survey, your instrument is as sharp and focused as possible, ready for the really big psychometric tests.
Okay, so after all this incredibly careful crafting, the theoretical grounding, the expert reviews, the cognitive interviews, the initial pilot testing and item analysis, we finally move into the ultimate test, right? How do we truly know our instrument is strong? How do we know it consistently measures what it's supposed to, and that the scores we get are genuinely meaningful and actually reflect reality? This feels like the moment of truth.
It really is. And this brings us squarely to the core psychometric properties that define a strong measurement instrument: reliability and validity. These are distinct but deeply interconnected concepts, and they are absolutely fundamental to any claim of rigorous research and to building credible, trustworthy knowledge.
Reliability and validity. Okay, how should we think about those?
Think of it this way. Reliability is all about the consistency of your measurement. If you measure the same thing repeatedly under the same conditions, do you get similar results? Imagine you're shooting arrows at a target. Reliability is about how closely grouped together your arrows are on the target, regardless of whether they hit the bullseye or not.
No.
Are the shots clustered?
Okay, so consistency, got it.
Validity, on the other hand, is about whether the instrument actually measures what it claims to measure. Are you truly capturing happiness, or are you maybe measuring something slightly different, like just general contentment or absence of sadness? Using the target analogy again, validity is about actually hitting the bullseye. Are your shots, even if they're tightly clustered, centered on the intended mark?
Okay. So consistency versus accuracy, essentially.
That's a good way to put it. And it's really important to understand their relationship. You can have a reliable measure that isn't valid.
How so?
Think of a broken bathroom scale that always reads exactly 5 pounds too heavy. Every time you step on it, it gives you the same wrong weight. It's reliable because it's consistent, but it's not valid because it's not accurate.
Right, consistently wrong.
Exactly. But you absolutely cannot have a valid measure that isn't reliable. If your scale gives you wildly different readings every single time you step on it, jumping up and down by 10 pounds, how could you ever trust that any of those readings accurately measure your true weight? The consistency, the reliability has to be there first for the accuracy, the validity to even matter or be possible.
That analogy helps a lot. Let's start with reliability then, the consistency part. How do researchers typically assess that?
Well, the most widely used measure of reliability, specifically for internal consistency, is, again, that statistic, Cronbach's alpha. We keep coming back to it because it's so common.
Right.
Alpha tells you how well the survey items within a scale or subscale cluster or hang together. In other words, how homogeneously they seem to be measuring the same underlying domain or concept. A Cronbach's alpha of 0.70 is often regarded as sort of a minimum acceptable threshold for a scale that's still under development.
0.70 minimum.
Yeah. But for more established questionnaires or in high-stakes situations, a higher alpha, like 0.80 or even 0.90 or 0.95, is often preferred, sometimes considered the gold standard.
Why the higher standard?
Because a consistently high alpha is like having a really well-oiled machine. It means pretty much every single item is working in perfect synchronicity with the others to measure that same underlying construct. That gives you immense confidence in the consistency of your results. That's the mark of a truly robust, trustworthy measure. And as we hinted at before, it's also common, and often better practice, to report alpha for separate domains or subscales within a larger questionnaire, rather than just one single overall score for the entire instrument, because different subparts might perform differently in terms of their internal consistency. Beyond internal consistency, there's another important type, retest reliability. This measures temporal stability, basically. Is a participant's score repeatable over a period of time?
How do you check that?
You administer the same items on 2 separate occasions, maybe a few weeks apart, to the same group of people. Then you correlate their scores from time 1 and time 2. Higher correlations indicate higher retest reliability, meaning the measure is stable over time. Of course, this assumes the underlying construct itself hasn't genuinely changed in that time period. If someone's optimism score is drastically different a week later, it might be an issue with the scale stability, or maybe something significant actually happened in their life to change their optimism.
Okay, so internal consistency with alpha and stability over time with test-retest. Are there other ways researchers check for reliability?
Yes, there are a few others, though maybe less common than alpha. For instance, there's split-half reliability. This involves splitting the scale items into 2 halves, like odd versus even-numbered items, and then comparing the scores from the first half to the second half for consistency. There's also looking at inter-item correlation, which examines the correlation of each individual item with every other individual item in the scale. And in situations where ratings are made by observers rather than self-report, you'd look at inter-observer reliability. How consistent are the ratings between 2 different observers when they assess the same measure in the same individual? The overall goal across all these different methods is fundamentally the same, to ensure that your measurement tool is producing consistent, dependable results under consistent conditions.
Now, to really help us grasp the nuance of reliability in practice, let's circle back to our running case study, the reproductive empowerment scale. You mentioned earlier that when they analyzed its reliability, one particular subscale, the one focused on decision-making, revealed a pretty crucial challenge. Can you remind us about that and what it meant?
Yes, that's a great illustration of why this detailed analysis really matters. In the validation study for the reproductive empowerment scale, the overall Cronbach's alpha for the full model was excellent. It came in at 0.87, which is considered very good.
Okay, sounds great overall.
Right. However, when they broke it down and looked at the individual subscales or domains, the decision-making subscale consistently showed a lower alpha, specifically around 0.53.
Ooh, that's quite a bit lower than the 0.70 minimum you mentioned.
It is, and that immediately highlights a potential weakness. It strongly suggests that the items within that decision-making subscale might not be coherently measuring the same thing as strongly or consistently as the items in the other subscales are. This signals a need for further investigation or possibly revision of those specific questions. In fact, further analysis in that particular study showed something even more telling. This decision-making domain was the only domain of empowerment they measured that did not significantly increase the odds of women actually using contraception, which was an expected outcome based on the theory underpinning the scale.
Wow, so the psychometric weakness had a real-world correlation, or lack thereof.
Exactly. It shows that even a scale that looks pretty good overall might have specific components that need more refinement because they aren't performing as expected, either statistically or in relation to real-world outcomes. It really underscores the importance of looking beyond just the total score.
That really does drive home why breaking it down by subscale is so important. Okay, so reliability is about consistency. Now, let's shift focus to validity, making sure we're measuring the right thing, the accuracy part. How do researchers establish that empirically? It seems even more challenging than consistency.
You're right. It is often considered more challenging and arguably even more fundamental. Beyond content validity, which we discussed earlier in the item refinement phase, making sure items cover the content domain, we move into the broader concept of construct validity.
Construct validity, okay.
This is really the overarching question. Is the instrument truly measuring the theoretical construct, trait, or concept it's supposed to measure? It refers to the degree to which the inferences we make from the observed scores can be legitimately tied back to the underlying theoretical constructs we're interested in. It's all about ensuring your numbers actually mean what you think they mean in the real world. Think of it like being a detective. Are you truly investigating the crime you set out to investigate, or have you maybe gotten sidetracked and are actually investigating something else entirely? Construct validity ensures you're focused on the right target.
And how do they go about doing that empirically? What are the main tools in their statistical toolbox for assessing construct validity?
One of the primary techniques, especially when developing a new scale or exploring an existing one in a new context, is something called exploratory factor analysis, or EFA. Imagine you have that big jumble of survey questions you started with, even after some refinement. You want to see if they naturally group themselves together into underlying themes or concepts. Maybe all the questions about positive affect clustered together, and all the questions about life satisfaction clustered together. That's essentially what EFA helps you do. It explores the data to uncover these hidden factors or dimensions within your measure based on how the items correlate with each other. It also helps researchers identify and potentially remove redundant or unnecessary items as they see which items truly load onto which underlying factors. For developing new scales, EFA is generally recommended to precede confirmatory factor analysis because it empirically appraises the underlying factor structure first. It helps you discover what latent factors seem to be present in your data. Then, following EFA, or sometimes used independently if you have a strong pre-existing theory, there's confirmatory factor analysis, or CFA.
CFA. So EFA explores, CFA confirms.
Exactly. While EFA is about exploring and discovering the structure, CFA is about testing a hypothesized factor structure. Here, the researcher proposes a specific model beforehand, maybe based on theory or previous EFA results, assigning specific items to specific factors. Then they use CFA to confirm whether that proposed measurement model is actually replicated in a new set of sample data. CFA often employs powerful statistical techniques like structural equation modeling, or SEM. Structural equation modeling. It's a comprehensive statistical framework that's used to test and estimate complex causal relationships among both observed variables, your actual survey items, and unobserved or latent variables, the underlying constructs like happiness simultaneously. It's like you've drawn up a detailed blueprint for how your items should relate to the underlying factors, and CFA-SEM is the process of checking if the actual building matches that blueprint when you collect real data.
So ideally, you'd do EFA first on one sample to find the structure, then CFA on a different sample to confirm it. But you mentioned earlier there are common missteps researchers make here. What are some of those pitfalls?
That is the ideal sequence. Yes, EFA on one sample, CFA on another. However, there are definitely some common limitations seen in practice that can undermine confidence in the results. One very frequent issue is conducting both the EFA and the CFA using data collected from the very same sample of participants.
Why is that bad?
When this happens, it can lead to artificially inflated good fit results in the CFA. It makes it seem like the model is a better fit for the data than it might truly be in a new sample, because it's essentially confirming a structure that was derived from the very same data it's being tested on. It's a bit circular. It's like taking a test, then designing the answer key based on your own answers, and then grading yourself you're likely to get a good score, but it doesn't prove much about your knowledge in a new situation.
Okay, that makes sense. What else?
Another limitation you sometimes see is simply the lack of CFA being performed at all. Researchers might stop after EFA, which means they miss the opportunity to rigorously test their hypothesized structure in a confirmatory way. There's also inherent subjectivity in identifying and labeling the factors that emerge from EFA. It requires researcher interpretation, which can introduce bias. And sometimes researchers simply report unsatisfactory factor analysis outputs, meaning the model just didn't fit the data well, which raises serious questions about the scale structure. So for best practice, and this is really crucial for strong psychometric work, future studies should absolutely make every effort to use separate independent samples for EFA and CFA. This is critical for strengthening the psychometric rigor and boosting our confidence in the generalizability of the findings. If a factor structure emerges in one sample, EFA, and then that same structure is confirmed in a completely independent sample, CFA, you have much, much stronger evidence for the constructive validity of your measure.
Now, when researchers do use CFA, they employ various statistical fit indices to assess how well their hypothesized model actually fits the collected data. Think of these fit indices as a panel of judges, each giving a score on how well your proposed model aligns with the reality captured in your data.
What are some examples of these fit indices?
There are quite a few, but some common ones include the root mean square error of approximation, or RMSEA. For this one, you want the number to be small, ideally 0.06 or less. A smaller RMSEA means your model has less error. It misses explaining the data by a smaller amount.
Okay, low RMSEA is good.
Right. Then you have indices like the Tucker-Lewis Index, TLI, and the Comparative Fit Index, CFI. For these, you want them to be high, ideally 0.95 or greater. High TLI and CFI suggest that your model explains the data significantly better than a very simple baseline model, usually one assuming no relationship between variables.
High TLI and CFI are good.
Exactly. It's like an architect meticulously checking every beam and joint in the blueprint against the build structure to ensure it's sound. These indices give us statistical confidence that the proposed structure isn't likely to collapse under scrutiny. Another common one is the standardized root mean square residual, or SRMR, which should ideally be 0.08 or less. It reflects the average discrepancy between the correlations observed in your data and the correlations predicted by your model.
So a whole battery of tests to check the fit.
Yes, but it's important to remember these are statistical guides. They don't replace theoretical sense. A model might statistically fit the data according to these indices, but if it makes absolutely no theoretical sense, or if the factors don't align with your construct definition, you still have serious questions about its validity. The statistics and the theory have to align.
Okay, that makes sense. Factor analysis seems like a huge part of construct validity. But beyond that, what other specific types of validity are essential to consider for a really well-designed scale? It seems like there's a whole constellation of factors that need to align perfectly.
You're right. Construct validity is multifaceted, and factor analysis is just one piece, albeit a large one. There are several other crucial aspects we need to examine. For instance, there's convergent validity.
Convergent validity.
Yes. This examines whether different ways of measuring the same concept yield similar results. Essentially, your new scale should correlate highly, statistically, with other existing well-validated measures that are designed to measure the exact same construct. If your brand new happiness scale doesn't correlate strongly with several other established happiness scales, that's a major red flag. It suggests your scale might not actually be measuring happiness, or at least not in the same way.
Okay, so it should converge with similar measures. What about the opposite?
That brings us to discriminant validity, sometimes called divergent validity. This assesses whether your construct is genuinely distinct from other theoretically different concepts. Your scale scores should have predictably low or weak correlations with measures of unrelated constructs. This is absolutely critical for differentiating your new construct from rival or conceptually similar alternatives. For example, your new work engagement scale should probably correlate somewhat with job satisfaction as they're related, but it shouldn't correlate so highly that they seem indistinguishable. And it should have a very low correlation with something theoretically unrelated, like maybe political affiliation. It shows your measure has its own unique identity.
Makes sense. Convergent shows it relates to similar things. Discriminant shows it differs from unrelated things. What else?
We also look at predictive validity, or sometimes called nomological validity. This examines whether the scores from your scale empirically relate to the scores of other conceptually related constructs, or even future outcomes in ways that are expected by your underlying theory. It's about seeing if your measure fits into the broader nomological network of related concepts. For example, does a well-validated job satisfaction scale actually predict the likelihood of an employee quitting their job 6 months later, as organizational theory would suggest it should? If your scale works as a predictor of related outcomes, or correlates with related constructs as theory predicts, that provides strong evidence for its validity. Closely related to predictive validity is criterion validity. This specifically assesses the empirical association of your new scale with some kind of gold standard criterion measure, especially if your scale is intended to predict a certain behavior or outcome. For example, if you have a scale designed to measure likelihood of purchasing a product, does it actually correlate well with actual purchasing behavior, the criterion?
So does it predict a specific important outcome?
Exactly. And finally, there's a technique called known groups differentiation. This asks, does your measure behave as expected when comparing distinct groups that are theoretically known to differ on the construct you're measuring. For instance, a scale measuring water insecurity should logically show significantly higher scores in households that have documented E. coli present in their drinking water compared to households known to have clean water. If your scale can successfully differentiate between these known groups in the expected direction, it provides strong supporting evidence for its validity. It shows it's sensitive to real-world differences that matter.
Wow. Okay, so it's really an exhaustive process. Content validity, EFA, CFA, convergent, discriminant, predictive, criterion, known groups, all to ensure you're consistently measuring the right thing. What about those broader validity concepts we sometimes hear about, like internal and external validity? How do they fit into this picture? Are they related to the scale itself or more about the study design?
That's a great distinction to make. Internal and external validity are also crucial concepts, but they typically operate at a slightly different level, more related to the overall research design and the conclusions drawn from the study, rather than just the psychometric properties of the measurement instrument itself, although they are related.
Okay, how so?
Internal validity signifies whether the study results are valid for the specific study population you investigated. Essentially, within the confines of your particular study, can you confidently say that your independent variable actually caused the observed changes in your dependent variable, or could something else explain the results, like confounding variables? It's about establishing a clear cause and effect relationship within your specific research setting. A reliable and valid measure is necessary for good internal validity, but it doesn't guarantee it. The study design matters too. External validity, on the other hand, refers to the generalizability of your study findings. Can the results and conclusions from your study be reasonably applied to other populations, other settings, or other contexts beyond the specific ones you studied? A measure might be perfectly reliable and valid, and your study might have high internal validity for your specific group of participants, say, college students in one city, but it might lack external validity if those findings can be generalized to, say, older adults in rural areas. Achieving both high internal and high external validity is the ideal goal, making your research findings both robust within the study and broadly applicable to the real world. And having a well-validated scale that works across different groups is key to achieving that external validity.
This definitely raises an important practical question. Even with the absolute best theoretical groundwork and doing all this rigorous testing of reliability and validity, how do we ensure we actually gather enough data and the right kind of data to make all these sophisticated psychometric analyses meaningful in the first place? What are the real-world considerations and maybe common pitfalls in that data collection phase, especially when we think about critical issues like getting proper consent and managing data ethically?
That's a absolutely critical point, because the quality and the quantity of your sample, along with how you actually manage the data collection process, directly impact the strength of your findings, the reliability of your analyses, and ultimately the generalizability of your conclusions. Without adequate data, or with biased data, even the most sophisticated statistical analyses are fundamentally compromised.
So let's start with sample size. We touched on it briefly. Is there a magic number or at least a solid rule of thumb for how many participants you really need for these psychometric analyses like factor analysis?
There are indeed guidelines, and they're quite important to follow if you want stable results. A common rule of thumb, often cited for sample size when performing psychometric analysis, particularly factor analysis, is to have at least 10 participants for each item on the scale you're testing.
10 per item. So if you have a 20-item scale, you need at least 200 people.
Exactly. And ideally, some recommend aiming for an even higher ratio, maybe 15.1 or even 20.1, for more stability. However, here's a rather stark reality check from the literature. One systematic review found that over half of the published studies they looked at, a staggering 50.4%, actually used sample sizes smaller than this basic 10.1 rule of thumb for their psychometric analyses.
Wow, over half. What's the implication of that?
The profound takeaway here is that a huge chunk of published research in scale development might be built on statistically shakier ground than we often assume. Undersized samples can lead to unstable results, factor structures that don't replicate, or reliability estimates that are less precise. It's a critical lens through which you, as a reader of research, should evaluate any study reporting scale development. Did they have an adequate sample size? Now, more specific recommendations exist for factor analysis. For exploratory factor analysis, EFA, a sample size greater than 100 is generally considered fair to good, and broadly speaking, samples of 300 are often cited as being sufficient for robust results in many cases.
Smaller samples, say in the 100 to 200 range, might be adequate, but only under specific conditions, like if the item communalities, which reflect how much variance each item shares with the underlying factors, are consistently high, say 0.50, or if you have very strong factors with at least 10 items per factor loading strongly onto them, e.g. loadings around 0.4.
So context matters.
Definitely. Conversely, very small samples, less than 100 participants, or certainly having fewer than 3 participants per item, are generally considered inadequate for these types of factor analyses. They can lead to unstable factor solutions that are unlikely to replicate in other samples.
Okay, so getting enough people is crucial, but it also sounds like it's not just about the sheer number of people, but also who those people are. How do the sampling strategies researchers use affect the generalizability of the findings? And are there maybe ethical implications to consider if your sample isn't diverse or representative enough?
They are absolutely crucial, both for generalizability and ethics. A very frequent limitation reported in many scale development studies is the heavy reliance on homogeneous samples or convenience samples, like using only university students, or only people from one specific country, often the US, or only people easily accessible online. While these samples might be easier and cheaper to recruit, they severely limit the generalizability of the new scale. As one study explicitly noted, if all your participants are, say, US consumers, you cannot confidently generalize that scale's performance or norms to consumers in other cultural contexts or different demographic groups. Convenience samples are a well-known weakness because they raise serious questions about how widely the findings can actually be applied.
And the ethical angle.
From an ethical standpoint, it's quite important. If your research aims to inform policies, interventions, or practices that will affect a broad and diverse population, but your measurement tool was developed and validated using data only from a very narrow, unrepresentative segment of that population, like only wealthy, educated individuals, you risk developing solutions or drawing conclusions that simply don't fit, don't work for, or could even inadvertently harm other groups. So, to extend generalizability and also to enhance the ethical applicability of the research, the strong recommendation is for future studies to make concerted efforts to recruit heterogeneous and, ideally, truly random samples for evaluating construct validity and reliability. This diversification of the sample is crucial for achieving robust findings that truly reflect the intended target population, not just a narrow or privileged segment of it. It's really about ensuring fairness and relevance in the application of the research that stems from these measures.
Beyond who you ask, it seems like how you ask them, the actual data collection method, could also introduce biases or raise ethical concerns. What are the practical considerations there, especially thinking about things like informed consent and participant privacy?
You're absolutely right. The how matters immensely. One inherent concern with many questionnaires in the social sciences is self-reporting bias.
Right, people reporting on themselves.
Exactly. When participants report on their own attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors, there's always the possibility of social desirability bias. That's where they might respond in a way they think is more socially acceptable or favorable, rather than completely honestly. Or they might exhibit demand characteristics, where they try to guess what the researcher wants to find and tailor their answers accordingly.
So how do you deal with that?
Well, it's hard to eliminate completely. But to mitigate it, future research might need to consider incorporating more objective measures, like behavioral observations if feasible, or getting reports from independent sources, like teachers or parents, depending on the context, to supplement the purely subjective self-evaluations. This provides a more balanced picture. And this is also an ethical consideration. You want to ensure the data truly reflects reality as accurately as possible, not just what people want you to hear or what they think they should say. Then there's the practical choice between using web-based surveys versus in-person data collection. Web-based surveys obviously offer significant advantages in terms of time and cost savings, and they allow researchers to potentially reach very large samples with relatively minimal cost.
But there are downsides.
Yes, definitely. They come with potential limitations, like coverage bias. Certain individuals or entire groups might lack regular internet access and are therefore excluded. And there's non-response bias. The people who choose to respond to an online survey might differ systematically from those who don't, leading to an unrepresentative final sample. These biases need to be carefully considered and, if possible, addressed or at least acknowledged.
And in person.
In-person surveys or interviews, while generally more costly and time-consuming, can potentially reduce concerns about confidentiality, if handled well, and some of these biases. They allow for clearer explanations, rapport building, and potentially reaching populations less accessible online. Therefore, whenever feasible, and particularly for sensitive topics or populations where trust is paramount, in-person methods are often prioritized for their ability to potentially ensure higher quality, less biased data collection, and to ensure that the process of informed consent is truly understood by the participant.
What about the role of technology within data collection, maybe even in person? Can it help overcome some of these issues? Perhaps improving consent procedures or enhancing privacy for sensitive topics?
Yes, technology can definitely play a helpful role here. Using tools like computer-assisted personal interviewing, or AKKI, where an interviewer uses a tablet or laptop to administer the survey, can significantly reduce data entry errors compared to paper and pencil methods, and it can help standardize the interview process.
Okay.
And for particularly sensitive questions, maybe about sexual behaviors or substance use, self-interviewing formats like audio-computer self-assisted interviewing, or AKSI, can be very effective. In AKSI, the participant listens to the questions through headphones and enters their responses directly into a computer without the interviewer being involved in that part.
So more privacy.
Exactly. This method can increase the perceived confidentiality and, interestingly, often increases the honesty of responses on these sensitive topics because participants feel more private and less judged. So it's a way technology can potentially enhance both data quality and the ethical protection of participants' privacy. But regardless of the specific method used, paper, CAPI, online providing simple and clear directions to participants is absolutely paramount to minimize measurement errors. If people don't understand how to use the scale or what the instructions mean, you'll get bad data.
And that ties into ethics too, right?
Absolutely. Participants have a right to understand clearly what they're being asked to do and how their responses will be used. If instructions are confusing or ambiguous, participants might misunderstand questions or response options, which compromises the integrity of the data and potentially undermines their ability to provide truly informed consent. Also, a simple but effective technique is specifying a clear time frame for certain questions, like asking about behaviors in the last 30 days instead of just ever. This can greatly improve recall accuracy, as people are generally better at remembering recent events than those from long ago. This helps get more accurate data, which is itself an ethical imperative. We shouldn't base conclusions on faulty memories if we can avoid it.
So ultimately, it sounds like adhering to all these meticulous practices, from selecting the right sample size and strategy, to designing clear questions and instructions, choosing appropriate data collection methods, and always prioritizing informed consent and privacy, is really about building trust and confidence in the research process and its findings. It sounds like all these elements are deeply intertwined to ensure the overall credibility and trustworthiness of the results.
Absolutely. That's a perfect summary. While the specific sources we looked at don't necessarily use the terms credibility or trustworthiness as distinct psychometric properties alongside reliability and validity, the rigorous adherence to all these best practices we've discussed in sampling, item wording, data collection, analysis directly enhances the overall credibility and trustworthiness of the research findings. Well, for instance, using well-designed instruments developed through these careful steps and employing appropriate data collection methods helps ensure that the results you get are not merely artifacts of a flawed measurement procedure or sampling biases, but are more likely to reflect the true attributes or relationships you're studying. Controlling for potential biases, using representative samples whenever possible, being transparent about limitations. All these things make the findings more trustworthy and more ethically applicable in real-world settings. This entire systematic process, this whole deep dive we've taken, is essentially designed to maximize the confidence we and the scientific community and policymakers and the public can place in the data and, consequently, in the conclusions drawn from it. It's the scientific community's rigorous way of trying to say, you can trust these numbers, here's why.
You've walked us through a truly rigorous and frankly quite demanding journey of scale development. But let's be honest, in the messy real world, even with the absolute best intentions and following all these methods meticulously, sometimes scales just don't perform perfectly when they're put to the test in a broader study. What happens then? What happens when a carefully designed instrument shows unexpected weaknesses? Is it completely back to the drawing board, or are there ways to sort of quick fix or, more realistically, refine and improve an instrument without starting entirely from scratch?
That's a critical observation, and it really leads us to the heart of what robust, ongoing research truly looks like. Scale development, as we've said, is, by its very nature, an inherently iterative process. It's cyclical.
Iterative, meaning it repeats.
Exactly. The evaluation phase, where you're assessing reliability and validity with new data, provides essential feedback that loops directly back to the construction and refinement phase. Recognizing and openly addressing limitations or weaknesses that emerge isn't a sign of failure. It's actually a hallmark of strong, honest research. It's simply part of the scientific method you develop, you test, you learn, you refine, you test again. It's continuous improvement.
So when we talked earlier about expecting significant item loss during development, that wasn't a failure, right? It was more like a planned, rigorous filtering process.
Yeah.
Can you give us an example of a situation where after a scale is already developed, you definitively say, okay, based on this new data, this particular item probably has to go?
Precisely. The initial item loss is a necessary filter. But yes, even after a scale is developed and seems okay, further testing might reveal items that need to be dropped or modified. One of the first things researchers look for is items that continue to show poor performance across different studies or samples, such as items that consistently show poor discriminatory power, maybe floor or ceiling effects, where almost everyone answers at one extreme. Or items that consistently demonstrate redundancy, meaning they correlate extremely highly with another item, suggesting they're basically asking the exact same thing and one might be unnecessary. And yes, there are specific statistical indicators that often prompt item deletion even after initial development. Items that consistently show very low item total correlations across different data sets, maybe that 0.3 threshold we mentioned earlier, remain strong candidates for removal because they just aren't coherently measuring the same thing as the rest of the scale in practice. They're adding noise rather than signal. Similarly, items that don't uniquely load onto their intended factor and subsequent factor analyses, or those that consistently show very low factor loading, say below that 0.3 year or 0.40 mark across studies, are generally considered inadequate and are prime candidates for removal or serious revision. The goal is always to maintain a parsimonious, using only the necessary items, functional and internally consistent set of items, not just a long list for the sake of it. Another area that often comes up for modification involves those reverse scored items we discussed. If these items consistently seem to confuse participants in different studies, or if they repeatedly prove to be the worst-fitting items in factor analyses across multiple data sets, researchers may really need to reevaluate their necessity or consider removing them altogether. While they're sometimes included with good intentions to prevent that acquiescence bias, their persistent drawbacks in terms of clarity and psychometric performance can sometimes outweigh their theoretical benefits, ultimately making the data less reliable and harder to interpret.
Okay, so individual items can be dropped or tweaked, but what happens when a more complex model, like one you'd test in confirmatory factor analysis, CFA, doesn't quite fit the new data as well as expected? Can researchers just kind of tinker with the model until it looks good statistically, or is there a more principled, theory-driven way to refine the model structure itself?
That's where the process of model modification and confirmatory factor analysis, CFA, comes into play, and it needs to be done very thoughtfully. When a hypothesized structural equation model, SEM, your proposed factor structure doesn't demonstrate a good fit to a new set of data according to those fit indices we talked about, like RMSEA, CFI, TLI.
The statistical judges.
Exactly. Researchers often do modify or respecify the model. This might involve technically adding or dropping parameters, like allowing an item to load on a second factor if there's a theoretical reason, or allowing the error terms of two specific items to covary if they share some unique similarity not captured by the main factor. Statistical software provides modification indices that can suggest which specific changes might improve the model fit the most. However, and this is a really crucial caution, researchers need to be very careful with purely data-driven modifications. While these modification indices can be very helpful for fine-tuning an already reasonably specified model, maybe making minor adjustments, they are generally considered less appropriate for making large-scale changes or trying to salvage severely misspecified initial models.
Why is that risky?
Because overly relying on these data-driven modifications without a strong theoretical justification for each change can essentially turn your supposedly confirmatory analysis right back into an exploratory one. You risk capitalizing on chance characteristics of your specific data set, fitting the model perfectly to the random noise or quirks of that particular sample, rather than reflecting a true, generalizable, underlying theoretical structure. It's like tailoring a suit perfectly for one very specific person's unusual measurements, but then finding it fits absolutely no one else. Also, as a related point, researchers should generally avoid using item parceling as a quick fix for poor model fit.
Item parceling, what's that?
That's where you sum or average several related items together to create a smaller number of parcels or composite scores, and then you use those parcels in your CFA model instead of the individual items. Well, it might seem to simplify the analysis and sometimes makes the model fit statistics look better superficially.
Sounds tempting.
It can be tempting, but it's generally frowned upon because item parceling can actually hide the true complex relationships among the individual items. More importantly, it can mask underlying model misspecification, leading to a false sense of having a well-fitting model when the problems are just being averaged out or swept under the rug. You lose important information about how individual items behave.
So if you do decide to modify a model based on some combination of theory and modification indices, how do you ensure the changes you made are robust and not just specific to that one data set you used? How do you avoid that trap of just massaging the data until it looks good?
This is where cross-validation becomes absolutely key. If a measurement model is modified or respecified based on the results from one sample, it is highly recommended, almost essential, to then cross-validate that respecified model using a completely separate, independent sample of data.
Test it again on fresh data.
Exactly. This step is crucial to establish the predictive validity and the stability of the modified model. It helps ensure that the improved fit you achieved wasn't just an artifact of capitalizing on chance in the first sample, and that the revised model actually holds up and performs as expected in new independent contexts. Without cross-validation, any apparent improvements gained from model modification remain suspect and might not generalize.
Let's circle back one last time to our real-world example, the reproductive empowerment scale. How did the researchers deal with the weaknesses that emerged during their validation, especially with that decision-making subscale, the one with the low Cronbach's alpha and the unexpected lack of association with contraceptive use? Did they just drop it?
That's a perfect illustration of this iterative improvement process in action, and the fact that sometimes the answer isn't a quick fix. Recall, yes, the decision-making subscale consistently had that low Cronbach's alpha around 0.53, indicating its items weren't clustering together as tightly or consistently as desired. Furthermore, in their larger study analyses, this was the only domain of empowerment measured by their scale that did not significantly predict or associate with women actually using contraception, which is a key outcome expected based on the theory behind reproductive empowerment.
So a double whammy, weak internal consistency and weak predictive validity for that part.
Exactly. This was a critical finding because it suggested a real-world implication tied directly to a specific psychometric weakness within one component of the scale. Now, importantly, the researchers explicitly acknowledged this as a limitation in their published work. Transparency is key. Based on their report, they weren't planning to immediately drop the subscale entirely at that stage, perhaps because decision-making is theoretically central to empowerment. However, the finding strongly implies a need for further revision of that specific subscale. It suggests that maybe the current items aren't fully capturing the nuances of reproductive decision-making in that particular cultural context, or perhaps there's a more complex relationship between perceived decision-making power and actual behavior than the items captured.
So more work needed.
Definitely. This might involve going back to do more qualitative research, maybe more interviews or focus groups, specifically focused on understanding why these particular items didn't perform as strongly, or how women in that population truly conceptualize and experience decision-making related to reproduction. This example really illustrates that even with a rigorous initial validation process, some components of a scale may still require further iterative refinement, deeper understanding through mixed methods research, or perhaps even theoretical rethinking. Scale development is often a continuous journey of improvement, not a final destination you reach and then stop.
That's a fantastic summary of the iterative nature of this. So, as we've explored pretty deeply today, developing robust measures isn't just about, crafting a few clever questions. It's really a systematic, demanding, rigorous journey that ultimately underpins all reliable knowledge in the human and social sciences. It's a painstaking process, isn't it? Moving carefully from defining those abstract concepts to meticulously fine-tuning question wording, doing rigorous piloting with real people, ensuring statistical reliability and validity through multiple tests, and even carefully considering the ethical implications of how we gather and manage our data.
Absolutely. And by understanding these meticulous steps, hopefully, we can all have greater confidence in the data that ultimately shapes our understanding of the world around us, whether we're reading research, evaluating policies, or just making sense of human behavior. This deep dive truly shows that robust measurement isn't just some dry academic exercise. It's absolutely foundational to building knowledge that can genuinely be understood, trusted, and applied in meaningful ways.
Right, informing everything from public health interventions, maybe educational practices, organizational strategies, and hopefully ultimately improving lives in some way based on solid evidence.
Precisely. And the process of validation, as we saw, is really ongoing, even for well-established scales. Because contexts change, populations evolve, and our theoretical understanding of human experience deepens over time. Measurement needs to keep pace.
So this really begs a final question for you, our listener, to think about. What complex, maybe abstract concept out there are you curious about measuring? And now, armed with this deeper understanding of the rigor involved, how might you begin to think about designing an instrument or critically evaluating an existing one to capture its nuances in a way that contributes to truly robust, reliable, and valid knowledge?